They called him an assistant. That was the neat phrase the newspapers used, the phrase that fit into headlines and municipal gossip, and the polite dismissal that kept most people from looking too closely. To the world, Finn Calloway, 23 years old, slight, always with a pen behind his ear, was the efficient, unremarkable man who managed schedules, routed calls, and smoothed the boss's public image. What the world did not know was what the world never wanted to admit, that behind the neat folder of professional duties, Finn kept a life that belonged to no headline. He was the person Marco Rinaldi loved. The night Marcus Ellis found him, Finn was crouched at the edge of the highway like an animal that had been pushed out of a cage. Snow came thin and fine, a hush that made the world feel smaller and meaner. Marcus, a former deputy now in his late 40s, was driving home from a long shift at the community center, steering a battered pickup through the dark when he saw a figure hunched under the flicker of hazard lights. Marcus eased the truck to the shoulder and killed the engine. The heat died, the glass fogged. He could see the young man's breath as it fogged the night, small, quick puffs. Finn's coat was expensive looking at a glance, but soaked and frayed at the cuff. He moved as if he were trying to make himself smaller, hands tucked beneath his knees. A small leather case sat beside him, zipped but not locked. Marcus climbed down into the snow without thinking of risk. He had been a deputy for 20 years and had learned when to trust a sense in the chest that said, "Help this one." He was not the sort of man who believed in miracles. He believed in doing what needed to be done. As he approached, Finn looked up. Eyes the color of old pennies, exhausted, terrified, not yet used to being seen. "You all right?" Marcus asked, his voice low, not loud enough to startle. Finn blinked, then nodded, though his whole body shook. My car went off a little," he said. He was speaking in little clipped sentences, a habit of someone trying to measure pain. "I was trying to get back to the city." His hands trembled when he fumbled for the leather case. Inside, beneath a stack of business cards, a cufflink shone, small, engraved with a stylized R. He pushed the small object back like it might bite. Marcus did not ask the kind of questions Finn might have rehearsed for himself. He offered a blanket and a thermos of coffee, the staples he kept in the truck since he started driving the back roads after leaving the department. Finn accepted the blanket like a man accepting the possibility of warmth for the first time in a long time. He told Marcus his name, Finn Calloway, 23, and that he worked downtown as an assistant. "To Mr. Rinaldi," he added after a beat, as if admission might cost him. Marcus heard the tremor under that name, the way it clung like a lifeline and like a chain all at once. "You okay if I take you home?" Marcus asked. He knew the practicalities. A young man, stranded on a cold night, alone. He also felt the weight of the moment. There was a hollow in Finn's face that made Marcus think of his last year on the force, the calls that never stopped with good endings. Finn hesitated. He looked down at his hands, and then at the dark highway behind them, at the vague line of trees. "No," he said, "not home. Can I sleep in your truck for a while? I'll go in the morning." He swallowed. "I can't go back tonight." Marcus thought about the thin veneer of downtown, the small, polite phrases that covered a tangle of debts, favors, and threats. He thought about Finn's age, 23, young enough to still believe in being rescued, old enough to know better. He thought of his daughter, who had left for college and who called sometimes on the wrong days, of the slow grief that sat like an ache in his chest since then. He could have driven on. He did not. "Come on," Marcus said. He helped Finn into the cab, wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, and watched as the steam of the coffee curled into the air between them. There was a tightness in Finn's jaw when he relaxed, like a man who had been taught to hold himself small in the world. Before Finn fell asleep, he pressed the leather case into Marcus's lap. Don't lose this," he murmured. "It's just—" He stopped. He could not make the explanation fit. Marcus pocketed the case like a promise. He would not pry, not then. He pulled the truck off the road and let the heater work. A soft radio hummed in the background. Snow fell in the quiet that had the weight of old things settling in. If the opening served as a hook, an image of abandonment on a cold roadside, that was the smallest of the story's promises. In the days that followed, the road wound outward into more complicated territory. Rumors, a parked black sedan at the edge of the property, a text that arrived at dawn and then was deleted. Finn had come to the town as an assistant. He was, to everyone else, 23, polite, impeccably dressed, the man who made sure the boss's rivers of favors flowed in the right directions. He was also, behind closed doors, the boss's lover. Marcus had been around secrets before. He understood their gravity. Yet nothing prepared him for the way that quiet tenderness and the brutal logic of criminal obligation could coexist in someone's life. Finn's face, when he slept, looked younger than his years, as if the life he carried had stolen from him more than his adolescence. But when he spoke about small things, paint, the way light fell through the studio window at noon, his voice became a different person. The vocabulary of art settled in him, palette, underpainting, the ache of an unfinished work, and Marcus felt a thin ribbon of something like awe. Finn painted as though painting might stitch the world back together. Marcus was 39 when he resigned from the force, though he would correct anyone who tried to pin him to a date. It was a process, he said. Grief is a syllable you learn to split. He had come to work at the community center to keep himself busy, to knit the bruised edges of his life into something practical. A decade later, after nights of counseling teenagers and running food drives, the center had become his life. He lived alone in a modest house on the edge of town. He had been trained to observe small details. It's a habit that saves lives. Finn's presence in that house was meant to be temporary. He would sleep in Marcus's spare room, shower, dry his clothes, check his messages in the morning. But temporary shifted toward permanence as Finn's vulnerabilities became clearer. He had scars, not all visible, but the kind that had more to do with memory than with skin. He had been tied, at different times, to adults for whom loyalty meant silence. Being the assistant meant being invisible while also being essential. And loving someone like Marco Rinaldi meant existing at the center of contradictions. Marco Rinaldi was a man of fables in town. 50 years old, public rumors called him a man with merciless charm and a face that could unclench the laws of men. In town, he threw opulent dinners and paid for infrastructure projects quietly. Everywhere else, he was the man whose name carried weight. To his employees, he was a patron. To his enemies, he was a problem. To Finn, he had been private, small gestures, a wool scarf, a folded note left under a mug, the way his voice softened when he called in the middle of the night. The boss was a public titan and a private tenderness. That was the cruel calculus that kept Finn bound. The first week Finn stayed with Marcus, there was no dramatic arrival, only the silence that comes before a storm. The sound of a car idling outside at 3 a.m, 2 men in suits watching the community center from across the street, a call Finn would answer with a small voice that made Marcus's skin prickle. Finn refused to talk about what had happened the night he was left on the highway. He called it a falling out. He called Marco complicated. He also called a number he would never let Marcus touch. Marcus tried an instinctive approach. He used people he knew, contacts from his old life who owed him favors. Sheriff Joan Keller, who had once been his partner, was good at naming things. She came once for coffee, sat with Finn at the kitchen table, and listened without intruding. Finn told her he was 23, that he had nowhere to go that night, that his car had slid. Keller's eyes carried the steady weight of someone who had seen things and decided how to act. "You're connected to Rinaldi?" she asked, blunt and gentle. Finn's hands found his cup. "He's someone I care about. He asked me to be careful." "Care can be messy," Keller said. "You're an adult, Finn. You make choices. If you need protection, we'll see about it." She did not promise to solve what belonged to a web of legal and ethical knots. She offered instead a practical list. Shelters, a legal aid number, the name of someone who could represent someone caught in a case where organized crime and domestic entanglement overlapped. Finn accepted the list like a lifeline. He also accepted, hesitantly, Marcus's offer of room and board. Marcus watched him begin to breathe again in small measures. He slept through the night more often. His teeth stopped grinding when he spoke. He painted. He filled sketchbooks with small studies of the town, of the light that fell through the center's high windows, of the faces that became a lifetime of quiet study. His studio, the tiny back room of Marcus's house, separated by a sliding door, became a place where he could begin to hold the world differently. Dominic, the town's art teacher and a friend of Marcus's, knocked on that studio door one afternoon with a stack of canvases and 2 glasses of wine. He was in his late 30s, with ink-stained fingers and a warmth for people who had been through things. "We do an adult class at the center," he said. "You should come. Paint in public. The anonymity will be good." Finn blinked at the idea. "In public?" "In community," Dominic corrected. "Not like a show. Bring coffee and a ridiculous amount of paint. Let the work breathe." It took time, but Finn came. He showed up quietly at the class, hands stained with oil, and set up his palette near the window. Initially, he painted small, safe things: a bowl of fruit, a chair. Slowly, he began to take risks with color, letting bright blues and scarlet enter where shadow had been dominant. When he worked, his shoulders dropped in a way they never did when he was on the phone dealing with the boss's calendar. There were moments when the world outside the window reasserted itself. A black sedan idled down the block, and 2 men in dark coats watched the center's doorway. Marcus noticed them and felt his old instincts rise. He spoke to Sheriff Keller. They did not invent miracles. They arranged to have the center's cameras patrolled more frequently, and a deputy made a point of walking the corridor during Finn's classes. They did not promise invulnerability. They promised the mundane safety protocols that meant people could breathe a little easier. The tension crested in a way that was not theatrical, but was absolute. An evening when Finn's phone lit up with a call that pulsed terror through him. He looked at the screen as if it could burn him. The caller ID was a number he did not recognize. The text that followed was a single sentence: "I know where you are." Finn clutched the phone and then looked at Marcus like a child seeing a storm outside the glass. Panic had edges that were too sharp for words. Marcus sat down across from him. "Is that from—" "He thinks I'm a liability," Finn whispered. He said the word like a curse. "He told me once I was better left unseen. Tonight," his face folded, "it's not just threats from his enemies. It's the idea of me being left if I become a target." Marcus thought of the leather case in his pocket and the engraved cufflink. He thought of Marco Rinaldi's face as he had seen it in news photographs. Composed, charismatic, often framed with people who wanted something. There was a human being behind that image, of course, gentle in private and reckless in the theater of power, but Marcus did not want to conflate tenderness with safety, not anymore. When the boss finally appeared, he did so in a way that fit his life, quietly and at night. He did not storm the center, nor did he make a public spectacle. Marco Rinaldi came to the back door with an escort of 2 men who had faces that rarely laughed. He was older than Finn by decades. He wore an overcoat and gloves, and his hair had a silver thread that softened his jaw. He was also, unexpectedly, visibly tired. "Finn," Marco said when Finn opened the door. The voice softened in a way that tightened Marcus's chest, protective and apologetic in equal measure. There was a small present in Marco's hands, a wool scarf, folded into a pouch. The gesture was intimate in a way that made Marcus aware of the private life that had been hidden from prying eyes. Marco's eyes flicked past Marcus briefly, registering him, measuring him with a man who was used to reading rooms. "You cannot keep him here," Marco said, low enough that Finn heard the question behind it. "Can I live without him? Can I let him go?" Finn's face was a map of decisions. He looked at Marco, then at Marcus. I'm not your... He stopped, the old patterns asserting themselves. It was easier to complete sentences for other people than for yourself. I'm not asking you for permission to leave. Marco's backpack of power did not drop. It bowed slightly. I only ask that you be safe. Safe by staying? Finn demanded. He had the sharpness of someone who had practiced being brave. Tonight, you left me on the highway. The word left Marco's mouth like a stone. For a moment, Marcus could have sworn, though he had no right to, even in that tight exchange, to glimpse vulnerability in the man who had built a public reputation of unshakable composure. Marcus's hands curled into themselves. I was trying to protect you, he said, not entirely convincing himself. That moment could have become a violent collision. Instead, it became a series of negotiations, not all of them clean. Marco offered, quietly, to make arrangements that would keep Finn safe from external threats. He could put Finn somewhere more secure, offer him relocation, money, the logistics of invisibility. He could also, more dangerously, ask for the continued quietness that comes with remaining inside his orbit. Finn listened. He thought of the studio and the smell of turpentine and the way his hands had stopped shaking when he painted. He cooperated in ways that were limited and strategic. He did not confess crimes in public or in private if he could help it. The town watched, half spectator, half jury. Finn watched, and sometimes his face felt like someone bringing a lantern into a cavern. He felt said things that had no easy path out. Grief for what he had lost, guilt, relief. He also felt the small, stubborn joy of rediscovering himself. One late spring evening, months after the highway, Finn stood in Marcus's studio with a canvas propped on the easel. The painting was not pretty in the way people expected prettiness to be. It was honest. It depicted the red brick of the community center under snow, a small figure in the doorway holding a lantern. The light in the painting was warm and messy and imperfect. For Finn, that lantern was choice. They organized an art show at Dominic's gallery. Dominic insisted the proceeds go to the local youth shelter. The town came, some curious, some wanting to see the assistant who painted, some wanting to be part of the small miracle of a man making beauty out of a life that had been tended roughly. Marco did not come to the gallery. He did not need to be there for Finn to stand in his final independence. The show raised enough money to create a small roadside resource box, blankets, non-perishable snacks, a list of numbers for shelters and legal aid, and a small journal with a pen. Finn insisted the journal contain a page that read, in his handwriting, "If you need to be seen, take this." On the roadside box's inner lid was a small painting Finn had done, a lantern in the snow. It did not read as sentimental. It read as an instruction. The months that followed were not cinematic leaps to happiness. They were vignettes of repair. Finn went to therapy. He learned to sit with memory and not be owned by it. He taught painting at the center on weekends and watched teenagers with ink-stained fingers discover that making is a way of not collapsing. Marcus worked the center and sometimes stayed late to fix the broken boiler or to pack lunches. Sheriff Keller checked in occasionally, more as a human than a police officer. Marco faced hearings, and there were days when he arrived in a courthouse corridor to the flash of cameras and the murmur of people who could not reconcile the small, private gestures of tenderness with the public ledger of wrongdoing. There were no clean absolutions. Marco surrendered to certain consequences. In one of the quieter scenes that lingered in Finn's memory, small, almost private, Marco stood in the parking lot outside the courthouse and handed Finn the leather case that had once contained the cufflink. "Take it back," Marco said, "if you want it." Finn said nothing at first. He felt the tug of the object like a memory in his hand. He could have accepted it like a trinket of a life he had left. He could also give it away. He tucked it into his sketchbook instead, not as an act of possessiveness, but as an acknowledgement. "I'm not yours," he said. He said it kindly. He said it plainly. Marco's shoulders slumped and then squared, an adult learning the shape of responsibility. The relationship between Finn and Marco wound down into a different kind of articulation. It did not vanish overnight. People cannot rewrite years in a few pages. But tenderness need not equate to danger. Marco, to his credit, and to his own complicated end, sought an accounting that meant acknowledging that he had used power in ways that risked people. He was not absolved by any legal acts, but he did, privately and in the quiet, attempt to step out of a certain kind of control. Marcus, for his part, became something like a steadfast presence. He did not pronounce himself a savior. He was a man who had built, imperfectly, a house that could hold someone. He learned, in the slow days of cups of coffee and midnight conversations, that love and care are not the same as possession. He and Finn worked together to set up the resource box on a lonely stretch of the road where people frequently got stranded in winter. They painted its sign together. They placed a small laminated card inside with numbers for shelters and a list of the center's hours. It was small, practical, humble, and the image of it in Finn's painting became a symbol for him. There were other small rituals that stitched their lives. On Sundays, they made soup in the afternoon and listened to old records. Finn would tell stories about the way light would fall just so in the old warehouse where he had once held a private studio. Marcus told stories about patrols he had once taken in the county, and about the time he had once rescued a stray dog and given it to a kid on his block. The domesticity of it was not a fantasy, it was work. Finn learned that trust could be earned in the quiet act of someone bringing back your favorite brand of tea. Public perception changed slowly. Some people never stopped seeing Finn as the assistant. Some people saw him as a young man who had been used and discarded. Others could not square his gentleness with the way he had been tethered to a man like Marco Rinaldi. But the town, like most towns, learned to accept that people are complicated. Finn's shows became a small fixture, a night where people came not to gawk at a scandal, but to drink cheap wine and look at canvas. He donated proceeds to the youth shelter and to a legal aid fund for people escaping dangerous circumstances. Each check, each gesture rewrote the ledger of what it cost to have lived being someone else's secret. There were also legal consequences in the more bureaucratic sense. Marco faced charges. He negotiated. He did not disappear. He accepted penalties that would, in time, remove some of his influence. He also, privately, offered to fund a small endowment to the shelter he had once supported in a way that skirted the spotlight. The shelter accepted the funds cautiously, ensuring they were used transparently and routed through independent auditors. Finn did not take part in those arrangements. He would not be the means for whitewashing. He wanted no part in glamour tied to crimes. He demanded that any support for the shelter be unconditional and arrive in ways that acknowledged the harm done. It was a practice of accountability more than restitution, but it mattered. As the legal smoke cleared marginally, Finn's life widened. He rented a small studio space above Dominic's gallery and painted there on weekdays. He taught classes at the center. He became, in a small, steady way, someone the younger kids could point to and say, he shows up. Marcus kept his house open for Finn, and sometimes for others. A kid who had aged out of foster care and needed someone to show him how to pay bills. A trans teen who needed clothes. A woman who had left a dangerous partner and needed a night on a couch. The house was not a refuge from consequences. It was a place that took on cost and shared it. One of the last images the town held was not of courts or cars idling in the dark. It was a painting, Finn's painting of the red brick community center under snow, the small figure holding a lantern, and the actual roadside box with its little journal inside. They were symbols more than endings. Finn and Marcus sat on the porch of Marcus's house in the new season, watching the sky unloosen into blue. Marcus had a hand on Finn's shoulder, a touch that was steady and unpossessive. Finn was not a broken thing that needed fixing. He had been, and still could be, a person in motion. They did not pretend everything was fully mended. There were nights when Finn woke from dreams where hands closed around his throat, and the sound of cars idling outside made him reach for the door. There were times when Marcus could not sleep, and he would sit at the kitchen table and count the hours until morning. There were court dates and investigations and cold letters from journalists who wanted the scandal. But the thread that tied them now was a chosen family, deliberate, tender, and accountable. The final scene is small. It is the kind of quiet you notice when you have been listening for noise for a long time. Finn places the last canvas he painted in the gallery for a benefit auction. The money will go to the youth shelter and to legal aid. He signs his name on the back and feels a small humming in his chest. He walks outside into an evening that smells faintly of rain. The roadside box gleams under a lamplight. Someone has added a knitted scarf to its side. He smiles and tucks a small note into the journal. "If you need a person, call this number," and writes the center's phone. He walks back to Marcus's porch. Marcus stands, holding 2 mugs of tea, and offers one. They sit and watch the lamplight catch on the road. The town is not innocent. It will never be. Power leaves bruises in people's lives. Sometimes it also makes them accountable. That truth sits between them like a shared garment. They do not pretend to have solved everything. Finn knows he will never simply be just an assistant in the town's gossip, nor does he want to be defined by that title. He is an artist, a teacher, a person who loves and is loved. He is a survivor of a life that once made him invisible. Marco's absence is real, filled with courtrooms and accounts, and with an apology measured not as a plea for return, but as a responsibility accepted. Marcus is not his savior. He is a man who chose to answer when someone needed help. On the porch, Finn leans his head against Marcus's shoulder. They do not need grand statements. The road below seems to breathe. A car passes slowly, and inside it, someone tugs a scarf closer. The journal in the roadside box remains open. The painting in the gallery hangs under warm light. Choices have consequences. Some mean legal reckonings. Others mean the daily labor of being kind. In the quiet between them, Finn says, "I thought I had to be small to be safe." "You don't," Marcus replies. "And I thought loving him would always mean I had to hide," Finn adds. "It won't," Marcus says. This is not an assurance that all fear will go. It is an insistence that love can be redefined, away from possession and toward steadiness, toward keeping someone warm and teaching them how to keep themselves warm. They watch as a late commuter walks past the roadside box, his breath fogging. Finn and Marcus have no illusions that their small acts will fix everything. But they do believe that a life rebuilt, however cautious and slow, can ripple outward. Finn thinks of the kids who come to his classes and wonder whether paint can change them. He thinks of the ones who will read his note in the roadside box and feel less alone. If this kind of emotionally driven true crime romance draws you in, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this, where people who have been made small find ways to be seen. The story does not end like a tidy knot. Marcus and Finn do not move to a place where danger no longer exists. The law hums on. Marco's case runs its course, with no cinematic absolution, only paperwork and guilty pleas and a long accounting. Finn's art continues to demand patience, and his life continues to require vigilance. Yet there is a continuity of care that was not there before. Soup on the stove for someone who needs it, a legal fund for someone who cannot afford representation, a shelter bed kept open when another closed. Months later, at an event at the community center, the caravan of people who have been helped by the shelter stand together for a photograph. Finn's painting of the lantern is projected behind them. Sheriff Keller gives a short speech about community responsibility. Dominic introduces Finn to the small audience as someone whose work has transformed a few young lives. There are no grand pronouncements, only ordinary acts of acknowledgement. Marco, from the courthouse steps, watches a televised clip. He makes a donation through an independent foundation, insisting on transparency, a small way to attempt the language of accountability. At the end of the night, Finn slips away and walks to the roadside box. He opens the journal and reads messages from people who found it and left their stories. A teenage boy had written, "I read your note. I called. Someone came. Thank you." Finn pins that page carefully and adds it to his sketchbook. Back on the porch, Marcus and Finn share a thin blanket. The road has a rhythm: cars, the occasional shout, the distant sound of a couple arguing. The world is not a moral movie. It is messy and sometimes cruel, and sometimes kind, in ways that are hard to count. Finn is not just an assistant anymore, and the town knows, in a way that matters, that the man who loved Marco Rinaldi was a person with agency, talent, and a right to safety. "Do you ever regret leaving?" Finn asks as the sky eases into a colder blue. Marcus considers. "I'd regret not answering the night I found you on the road," he says. He is honest about other things too. But some choices aren't ours alone. Finn nods. He fits his hand into Marcus's, not a declaration, but a presence. They sit together, two people who were once broken and who have chosen to be steady for others. The roadside box stands like a small beacon. The painting glows in the distance. The law does not disappear, neither does human kindness. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it and checking the description for links to local LGBTQ+ shelters and resources. Small acts, calling a number, offering a bed, donating a coat, compound into safety for someone else. In a town made of unglamorous, honest choices, that work matters more than a headline ever will.